The rain hammered against the tall windows of the Whitmore estate with such force that Claire could feel the vibrations through the thick Persian rug beneath her feet. She stood in the center of the grand living room, her fingers trembling as they clutched the cream-colored envelope that had arrived that morning. The paper felt heavy, expensive, the kind that whispered of old money and carefully guarded secrets. The scent of her father's study still lingered in the air, that particular combination of leather-bound books, pipe tobacco, and the faint musk of aged whiskey that she had known her entire life. But now, 3 weeks after his funeral, that smell felt like a ghost, haunting the spaces where Richard Whitmore had once commanded attention with nothing more than his presence. Claire was 38 years old, the middle child, the one who had always tried to keep the peace. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the same black cardigan she had worn to the funeral, as if she could not quite let go of the mourning period. Her hands shook as she broke the wax seal on the envelope, the red wax crumbling between her fingers like dried blood. The letter inside was written in her father's distinctive handwriting, each letter precisely formed, the ink a deep blue-black that seemed to absorb the gray light filtering through the storm-darkened windows. The front door burst open with a crash that made Claire jump, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her older brother Marcus strode in, shaking rain from his expensive wool coat. Water droplets scattered across the hardwood floor, each one catching the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. Marcus was 42, tall and broad-shouldered, with their father's commanding presence and steel-gray eyes. He had flown in from New York that morning, and the tension in his jaw told Claire that he had received a letter too. Behind Marcus came their younger sister, Olivia, who at 34 still moved with the graceful uncertainty of someone who had never quite figured out where she belonged in the family hierarchy. Her blonde hair hung in wet strands around her pale face, and her green eyes were red-rimmed, though whether from crying or from the cold wind outside, Claire could not tell. Olivia's hands were empty, but the way she kept glancing at Marcus's briefcase suggested she knew what this gathering was about. The lawyer, Mr. Theodore Ashworth, arrived exactly 15 minutes later, as punctual as death itself. He was a thin man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slid down his narrow nose. He carried a leather portfolio that looked older than Claire, and when he set it down on the mahogany coffee table, the sound echoed through the room like a judge's gavel. The scent of rain and wet wool filled the space as everyone settled into the furniture that had been in the family for generations. Claire chose the wingback chair that had been her mother's favorite, before cancer had taken her 10 years ago. Marcus claimed the leather sofa with the confidence of someone who expected to inherit everything. Olivia perched on the edge of an ottoman, looking like she might bolt at any moment. Mr. Ashworth cleared his throat, a dry sound that seemed too loud in the heavy silence. He pulled out a thick document, the pages crisp and official-looking, and began to read in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever. The will was straightforward at first. The estate, valued at approximately $12 million, was to be divided among the 3 siblings. The house, the investments, the various properties scattered across 3 states, all of it carefully catalogued and assigned. Claire felt her shoulders begin to relax. Perhaps this would be simple after all. Perhaps they could get through this without the drama that had characterized so much of their childhood. Then Mr. Ashworth reached the final page, and his voice changed, just slightly, taking on a note of discomfort that made Claire's stomach clench. There was a condition, he explained, adjusting his glasses nervously. A rather unusual condition that Richard Whitmore had insisted upon, despite Mr. Ashworth's professional advice to the contrary. The inheritance would only be distributed if all 3 siblings could prove, beyond any doubt, that they were biologically related to Richard Whitmore. DNA tests had been arranged. The results would be delivered in 1 week. Until then, everything was frozen. The silence that followed was so complete that Claire could hear the old grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, each second falling like a stone into still water. She looked at Marcus, whose face had gone pale beneath his tan. She looked at Olivia, who had pressed both hands over her mouth as if to hold back a scream. Claire's own thoughts were spinning, tumbling over each other like leaves in a storm. What did this mean? Why would their father demand such a thing? What secret had he been keeping all these years? Marcus was the first to speak, his voice rough and angry. This was ridiculous, he said, standing up so quickly that the coffee table shook. This was an insult to their mother's memory, to everything their family stood for. He demanded to know if this was some kind of sick joke, if their father had lost his mind in his final days. Mr. Ashworth remained calm, explaining that Richard Whitmore had been of completely sound mind when he drafted this version of the will, just 6 months before his death. He had been insistent, almost desperate, that this condition be included. Olivia started crying then, soft hiccuping sobs that she tried to muffle with her hands. Claire went to her, kneeling beside the ottoman and wrapping her arms around her younger sister. Olivia felt small and fragile, her whole body shaking. She whispered something that Claire almost could not hear over the sound of the rain. She said she had always known something was wrong, that she had never quite fit in, that maybe this explained why their father had always looked at her with such sadness in his eyes. Claire wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be fine, but the words stuck in her throat. Because the truth was, she did not know if everything would be fine. She did not know what these DNA tests would reveal. And somewhere, in a dark corner of her mind that she did not want to examine too closely, she realized that she had her own doubts, her own questions that had never been answered. Marcus was pacing now, his expensive shoes leaving wet marks on the hardwood floor. He was talking rapidly, his words tumbling over each other. He was saying that this changed nothing, that they were family regardless of what some tests said, that blood did not matter as much as the years they had spent together. But even as he spoke, Claire could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that was probably reflected in her own. Because if one of them was not Richard Whitmore's biological child, then everything they thought they knew about their family was a lie. And lies, Claire had learned, had a way of poisoning everything they touched. Mr. Ashworth explained the logistics in his dry, professional voice. The DNA testing facility was in Boston, a 3-hour drive from the estate. Appointments had been made for the following morning at 9 o'clock. The results would be processed with the highest priority and delivered to his office within 7 business days. He would contact them as soon as he received the information. Until then, he suggested they try to remain calm and remember that they were family, no matter what the tests revealed. After Mr. Ashworth left, the 3 siblings sat in silence, the weight of unspoken questions pressing down on them like the storm clouds outside. The rain had intensified, drumming against the roof with a rhythm that sounded almost angry. Claire could smell the dampness seeping into the old house, mixing with the scent of furniture polish and the faint aroma of the coffee that had gone cold in the kitchen. She wanted to say something, anything, to break the terrible tension, but every word that came to mind felt inadequate. It was Olivia who finally spoke, her voice small and broken. She asked if they remembered the summer when she was 7, when their father had taken Marcus and Claire on that fishing trip to Maine but had left her behind with their aunt. She had cried for 3 days, she said, feeling abandoned and unloved. Their mother had told her that their father just needed some time with the older children, but Olivia had never quite believed that explanation. Now, she wondered if there had been another reason, a darker reason that no one had wanted to tell her. Marcus stopped pacing and looked at Olivia with something that might have been guilt or might have been pity. He said he remembered that trip, remembered how their father had been distant and distracted the entire time, barely speaking except to give instructions about the boat or the fishing lines. Claire remembered it too, remembered thinking that their father seemed sad, almost grieving, though she had not understood why at the time. The conversation spiraled from there, each sibling pulling up memories like old photographs, examining them for clues they might have missed. Marcus talked about how their father had always pushed him harder than the others, demanding excellence in everything from grades to sports to eventually business. He had thought it was because he was the oldest, the one who would carry on the family name and legacy. But now he wondered if there had been something else driving that relentless pressure, some need to prove that Marcus was truly his son. Claire found herself thinking about her own relationship with their father, how he had always seemed most comfortable with her, most able to relax and laugh. She had been his favorite, she knew that, though no one had ever said it out loud. She remembered Sunday mornings when she was young, sitting in his study while he worked, the two of them comfortable in silence. He would occasionally look up from his papers and smile at her, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, and she would feel warm and safe and loved. Had that been because she reminded him of someone? Or because she was the only one he was certain was his? The night stretched on, and none of them wanted to leave, as if staying together in this house could somehow protect them from whatever truth was waiting in those DNA results. They ordered pizza, though no one ate much. The food sat congealing in the boxes on the kitchen counter, the smell of cheese and tomato sauce mixing with the mustiness of the old house. They opened a bottle of their father's best scotch, the one he had been saving for a special occasion that never came. The liquor burned going down, warming Claire's chest but doing nothing to ease the cold knot of anxiety in her stomach. As midnight approached, Marcus suggested they stay at the estate rather than driving back to their hotels in the storm. No one argued. It felt right, somehow, to spend this night in the house where they had grown up, surrounded by the memories of a childhood that might have been built on lies. Claire took her old bedroom, the one with the window seat where she used to read for hours, losing herself in stories of other families, other lives. The room smelled faintly of lavender, from the sachets her mother used to tuck into the drawers. Claire lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain and the old house settling around her, and wondered if she would sleep at all. She must have dozed off eventually, because she woke to pale morning light filtering through the curtains and the sound of voices downstairs. Her mouth tasted sour, and her head ached from the scotch and the crying she had done in the dark hours before dawn. She pulled on jeans and a sweater, both of which she kept in the closet for visits home, and made her way downstairs, following the smell of coffee. Marcus was already dressed in a fresh suit, looking like he had not slept at all. His eyes were bloodshot, and he held his coffee mug with both hands, as if drawing warmth from it. Olivia sat at the kitchen table, still in the clothes she had worn yesterday, her hair tangled and her face puffy. She looked up when Claire entered, and the expression in her eyes was so lost, so frightened, that Claire felt her heart break a little. They drove to Boston in Marcus's rental car, a sleek black sedan that smelled of new leather and air freshener. No one spoke much during the drive. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that looked washed clean, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed almost mocking in its cheerfulness. Claire watched the landscape roll by, the familiar roads and towns that marked the route to the city, and felt like she was traveling toward her own execution. The DNA testing facility was in a modern building downtown, all glass and steel and sterile efficiency. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and had that peculiar hush that medical facilities always seem to have, as if sound itself was being absorbed by the walls. A cheerful receptionist with bright red lipstick checked them in, completely unaware of the weight of what this test meant. They were called back one at a time, each disappearing through a door marked laboratory and returning a few minutes later with a small bandage in the crook of their elbow. The actual test was anticlimactic. A technician in blue scrubs swabbed the inside of Claire's cheek, then drew a small vial of blood, explaining that they were running both tests to ensure accuracy. The whole process took less than 10 minutes. Claire wanted to ask questions, wanted to demand answers right then and there, but she knew it did not work that way. Science took time. Truth took time. All they could do was wait. The drive back to the estate was even quieter than the drive there. Claire felt hollowed out, as if the blood they had taken had drained something essential from her. She kept thinking about her father, about the man she had loved and admired her entire life, and wondering what had driven him to create this situation. Had he known something? Had he suspected? Or had he simply been cruel, wanting to sow discord among his children even from beyond the grave? That thought felt disloyal, and Claire pushed it away. Her father had not been a cruel man. Demanding, yes. Difficult, certainly. But not cruel. There had to be a reason for this, some explanation that would make sense once they knew the truth. She clung to that hope like a lifeline. The week that followed was the longest of Claire's life. She tried to go back to her normal routine, returning to her apartment in Portland and her job as a high school English teacher. But she could not focus on anything. She stood in front of her classes, talking about symbolism in The Great Gatsby and the themes of To Kill a Mockingbird, and all the while her mind was spinning with questions about her own family story. Her students noticed her distraction, and more than one asked if she was feeling all right. She lied and said she was fine, just tired, and tried to smile convincingly. Marcus called every day, sometimes twice a day, always asking if she had heard anything from Mr. Ashworth. His voice sounded strained, and Claire could hear the stress in every word. He told her that he had been unable to work, that he had been sitting in his office staring at his computer screen, accomplishing nothing. His wife had asked what was wrong, and he had not known what to tell her. How did you explain that your entire identity might be a lie? Olivia did not call. Claire tried reaching out to her several times, but the calls went to voicemail. She sent text messages that went unanswered. Finally, on the 5th day, she drove to Olivia's apartment in Portsmouth, a small studio above a bakery that always smelled of fresh bread and cinnamon. She knocked on the door for 10 minutes before Olivia finally answered, looking like she had not left the apartment or showered since the DNA test. The apartment was dark, the curtains drawn, and there were empty wine bottles on the counter. Claire spent the afternoon with Olivia, opening the curtains to let in light, making her eat something, listening to her cry and rage and despair. Olivia was convinced that she was the one who was not Richard Whitmore's daughter. She had always felt different, she said, always felt like she did not quite belong. Their father had never looked at her the way he looked at Marcus and Claire. He had never seemed proud of her, never seemed to really see her. And now she knew why. Now it all made sense. Claire tried to reassure her, tried to say that they did not know anything yet, that she might be wrong. But the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Because the truth was, Claire had noticed those things too. She had seen how their father interacted differently with Olivia, how there was always a distance there that did not exist with his other children. She had told herself it was just personality differences, that some parents connected better with some children than others. But what if it had been something else? What if their father had known, or suspected, that Olivia was not his? On the 7th day, Mr. Ashworth called. His voice on the phone was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. He asked all 3 siblings to come to his office that afternoon at 3 o'clock. He would have the results then, and he would explain everything. Claire's hands were shaking so badly when she hung up the phone that she dropped it, the device clattering against her kitchen floor. She stood there for a long moment, staring at nothing, feeling like the world was tilting beneath her feet. She picked up Marcus and Olivia on the way, and the 3 of them drove to Mr. Ashworth's office in silence. The office was in an old brick building in downtown Portsmouth, the kind of place that had been there for 100 years and would probably be there for 100 more. The stairs creaked as they climbed to the 2nd floor, and the hallway smelled of old wood and lemon furniture polish. Mr. Ashworth's secretary, a woman in her 70s with kind eyes and gray hair and a neat bun, showed them into the conference room and offered them coffee or water. They all declined. Mr. Ashworth entered a few minutes later, carrying a manila folder that seemed too thin to contain something so important. He sat down across from them, folded his hands on the table, and looked at each of them in turn. His expression was grave, and Claire felt her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. The air in the room felt thick, hard to breathe, and she could hear Olivia's rapid, shallow breathing beside her. The results, Mr. Ashworth began, were conclusive. The laboratory had run the tests twice to ensure accuracy, and there was no doubt about the findings. He opened the folder, pulling out 3 separate reports, each one marked with a name. Claire watched his hands, noticed the slight tremor in his fingers, and realized that even this experienced lawyer was uncomfortable with what he had to reveal. Marcus was Richard Whitmore's biological son. The DNA match was 99.9% certain. Mr. Ashworth slid the report across the table to Marcus, who picked it up with hands that shook. Claire saw relief flash across her brother's face, followed immediately by guilt as he glanced at his sisters. Claire was also Richard Whitmore's biological daughter. Another 99.9% match. Mr. Ashworth handed her the report, and Claire stared at the numbers and scientific terminology, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. Because if she and Marcus were both Richard's children, that meant Olivia was not. The DNA test showed no biological relationship between Olivia and Richard Whitmore. They were not father and daughter. They had never been father and daughter. 34 years of Olivia's life had been built on a lie. The sound Olivia made was not quite a scream and not quite a sob, something raw and broken that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul. She stood up so quickly that her chair fell backward, clattering against the floor. She was shaking her head, backing away from the table as if the reports themselves could hurt her. Claire reached for her, but Olivia jerked away, her eyes wild and unfocused. She had known, Olivia said, her voice high and thin. She had always known something was wrong. But hearing it confirmed, seeing it written down in black and white, made it real in a way that her suspicions never had. She was not a Whitmore. She did not belong. She never had. Everything she thought she knew about herself, about her family, about her place in the world, was a lie. Marcus tried to speak, tried to say something comforting, but Olivia was not listening. She grabbed her purse and ran from the room, her footsteps echoing in the hallway. Claire started to follow, but Mr. Ashworth held up a hand, stopping her. There was more, he said quietly. More that they needed to know before they went after Olivia. Claire sank back into her chair, feeling numb. What more could there possibly be? What other secrets had their father been keeping? Mr. Ashworth pulled out another document, this one older, yellowed with age. It was a letter, he explained, that Richard Whitmore had left with instructions that it be opened only after the DNA results were revealed. It was addressed to all three of them, but particularly to Olivia. Mr. Ashworth began to read in his careful, measured voice. The letter was dated 6 months before their father's death, written in the same precise handwriting that Claire had known her entire life. Richard Whitmore began by apologizing, by saying that he knew what he was about to reveal would cause pain, but that he could not die with this secret. The truth, he wrote, was something that had haunted him for 34 years, something that had shaped every decision he had made, every interaction he had had with his children. Olivia was not his biological daughter, but she was his daughter in every way that mattered. Her mother, Catherine Whitmore, had had an affair 35 years ago, during a period when their marriage had been struggling. Richard had been working constantly, building his business, and Catherine had been lonely and unhappy. She had found comfort with another man, a brief relationship that had ended when she discovered she was pregnant. Catherine had confessed everything to Richard, had told him about the affair and the pregnancy, and had offered to leave if that was what he wanted. But Richard had loved her desperately, and he had made a choice. He would raise the child as his own. He would never speak of it again. They would be a family, and no one would ever know the truth. And for 34 years, they had kept that secret. Catherine had taken it to her grave, dying without ever telling her children the truth. Richard had tried to love Olivia the same way he loved Marcus and Claire, but he had found it difficult. Every time he looked at her, he saw the betrayal, saw the evidence of his wife's infidelity. He had tried to hide those feelings, had tried to be a good father to her, but he knew he had failed. He knew that Olivia had felt the distance between them, had felt unloved and unwanted, and that knowledge had eaten at him for decades. The letter went on, explaining that Richard had included the DNA test requirement in his will because he wanted the truth to finally come out. He was tired of the lies, tired of the secret that had poisoned his relationship with Olivia. He wanted her to know that it was not her fault, that she had done nothing wrong, that the distance between them had been his failing, not hers. He wanted her to understand why he had always struggled to connect with her, why he had always seemed sad when he looked at her. And he wanted to give her a choice. The inheritance was structured so that if Olivia was not his biological daughter, she would receive her full share regardless. The money was hers, no conditions, no strings attached. But more than that, he had left information about her biological father, a man named James Brennan who had been a colleague of Catherine's at the hospital where she had worked as a nurse. James had never known about Olivia, had never known that his brief affair with Catherine had resulted in a child. Richard had kept track of him over the years, and the letter included his current address and contact information. The choice, Richard wrote, was Olivia's. She could reach out to James Brennan if she wanted to know her biological father. Or she could choose not to, could choose to remember Richard as her father despite the lack of biological connection. Either way, he wanted her to know that he was sorry. Sorry for the distance, sorry for the pain, sorry for not being the father she deserved. He had loved her as best he could, but he knew it had not been enough. The letter ended with a plea to all three of his children to stay together, to not let this revelation tear them apart. They were siblings, he wrote, regardless of biology. They had grown up together, had shared a childhood, had been a family. He hoped that would be enough to keep them connected, even after the truth came out. Claire sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face. She thought about her mother, about the woman she had idolized, and tried to reconcile that image with someone who had had an affair. It felt impossible. Her mother had been kind and gentle and devoted to her family. How could she have betrayed her father like that? How could she have kept such a secret? But even as she thought it, Claire realized that she had never really known her mother's inner life, had never known what struggles or unhappiness she might have been hiding. People were complicated. She knew that from her years of teaching, from watching teenagers navigate their own complex emotions and relationships. Adults were no different. Her mother had been human, had made mistakes, had lived with the consequences of those mistakes for the rest of her life. Marcus was staring at the letter, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, if Mr. Ashworth knew anything else, anything that was not in the letter. The lawyer shook his head. Richard Whitmore had told him only what was necessary to execute the will. The rest, the emotional details, the full story, had died with Richard and Catherine. Claire stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her. She needed to find Olivia, needed to talk to her, to try to help her process this impossible information. Mr. Ashworth told her that Olivia had left the building, that his secretary had seen her get into a taxi. Claire pulled out her phone and tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried texting, but there was no response. Marcus suggested they go to Olivia's apartment, and Claire agreed. They left Mr. Ashworth's office in a daze, barely remembering to thank him for his time. The afternoon sun was bright and warm, completely at odds with the darkness Claire felt inside. They drove to Portsmouth in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, their own attempts to process what they had just learned. Olivia's apartment was empty. The door was unlocked, which immediately set off alarm bells in Claire's mind. Inside, the space looked like someone had left in a hurry. Drawers were open, clothes scattered on the bed, toiletries missing from the bathroom. Olivia's laptop was gone, along with her purse and phone charger. She had packed a bag and left, and Claire had no idea where she had gone. They tried calling again, tried texting, tried reaching out to Olivia's friends and coworkers. No one had heard from her. She had simply vanished, as if she could run away from the truth by running away from them. Claire felt panic rising in her chest, a tight feeling that made it hard to breathe. What if Olivia did something drastic? What if the revelation was too much for her to handle? Marcus seemed to be thinking the same thing. He called the police, but they told him that Olivia was an adult and had not been missing long enough to file a report. Unless there was evidence that she was in danger, there was nothing they could do. Marcus argued, his voice rising, but it did no good. The law was the law, and Olivia had every right to leave if she wanted to. They spent the evening searching, driving to places Olivia might have gone. The beach where they used to go as children, the park where she liked to run, the coffee shop where she spent hours working on her laptop. But there was no sign of her. As darkness fell, Claire felt desperation clawing at her. She kept thinking about the look in Olivia's eyes when she had run from Mr. Ashworth's office, that wild, broken look that suggested she was barely holding herself together. Finally, exhausted and out of options, they returned to the Whitmore estate. It felt wrong to be there without Olivia, wrong to be in the house that represented everything she had just lost. But Claire did not want to be alone, and she could tell that Marcus felt the same way. They sat in the living room where this had all started, drinking coffee because neither of them could face alcohol, and tried to figure out what to do next. Marcus broke the silence first, his voice rough with emotion. He said that he felt guilty for being relieved that he was Richard Whitmore's son, guilty for having that moment of happiness when Olivia's world was falling apart. He had always been the golden child, he said, the one who got everything right, the one their father was proud of. And now he knew that part of the reason for that was simply biology, simply the fact that he carried Richard Whitmore's DNA. It felt unfair, arbitrary, cruel. Claire understood what he meant. She felt her own guilt, her own complicated mix of emotions. She was relieved to know that Richard was her father, relieved that her identity was intact. But that relief felt selfish when she thought about Olivia, about what her sister was going through. And there was anger too, anger at her father for creating this situation, for not finding a better way to reveal the truth. Why had he waited until after his death? Why had he not told them while he was alive, when he could have helped them process it, helped Olivia understand? But even as she thought it, Claire knew the answer. Her father had been a coward, at least about this. He had not wanted to face the consequences of the truth, had not wanted to see the pain in Olivia's eyes or deal with the questions about Catherine's affair. So he had taken the coward's way out, leaving a letter and a lawyer to deliver the news after he was safely in the ground. It was, Claire thought bitterly, perhaps the most selfish thing he had ever done. They talked through the night, Marcus and Claire, sharing memories and trying to make sense of their family's history. They talked about their mother, about the woman they had thought they knew, and tried to imagine what her life had been like, carrying such a secret. They talked about their father, about his distance from Olivia, and realized that there had been signs all along, signs they had missed or ignored. They talked about Olivia herself, about the sister they loved and were desperate to find. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Claire's phone finally rang. It was Olivia, her voice small and tired. She was safe, she said, staying at a hotel in Boston. She needed time alone, time to think, time to figure out who she was now that everything she had believed about herself had been proven false. She asked them not to come looking for her, not to try to fix this. She would reach out when she was ready, but right now, she needed space. Claire wanted to argue, wanted to insist that they could help, that Olivia did not have to go through this alone. But she heard the exhaustion in her sister's voice, heard the fragile control that was barely holding back complete breakdown, and she knew that pushing would only make things worse. So she agreed, promised to give Olivia the space she needed, and made Olivia promise in return that she would call if she needed anything at all. The days that followed were strange and difficult. Claire tried to return to her normal life, but everything felt off-kilter, like she was walking through a world that had shifted slightly to the left. She taught her classes, graded papers, attended faculty meetings, and all the while her mind was elsewhere, worrying about Olivia, thinking about her parents, trying to understand how her family had become so fractured. Marcus called every few days, always asking if she had heard from Olivia. He had thrown himself into work, he said, trying to distract himself from the situation. But it was not working. He found himself thinking about Olivia at odd moments, remembering things from their childhood, wondering if he could have done something differently, been a better brother, noticed that something was wrong. Claire found herself doing the same thing, sifting through memories like old photographs, looking for clues. She remembered Olivia's 8th birthday party, how their father had been there but somehow absent, going through the motions but not really present. She remembered Olivia's high school graduation, how their father had clapped politely but without the pride and joy he had shown at Marcus's and Claire's graduations. She remembered 1,000 small moments of distance, of disconnection, and wondered how she had not seen what they meant. 2 weeks after the revelation, Olivia finally agreed to meet with them. She suggested a neutral location, a small cafe in Portland that none of them had been to before. Claire arrived early, her stomach in knots, and ordered a coffee she did not drink. Marcus showed up a few minutes later, looking as nervous as Claire felt. They sat together in silence, watching the door, waiting. When Olivia walked in, Claire barely recognized her. Her sister had cut her hair short, a dramatic change from the long blonde waves she had always worn. She looked thinner, her face gaunt, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. But there was something different in her expression too, something harder and more determined than Claire had ever seen before. Olivia sat down across from them, ordered a black coffee, and waited until the waitress had left before speaking. Her voice was calm, almost eerily so, as she told them what she had decided. She had spent the last 2 weeks thinking, really thinking about what the revelation meant and what she wanted to do about it. She had read and reread their father's letter, had cried and raged and eventually found a kind of acceptance. She was not angry at their mother, Olivia said. She understood that Catherine had made a mistake, had been unhappy and lonely, and had sought comfort where she could find it. She understood that Catherine had loved her, had chosen to keep her and raise her even when it would have been easier to give her up. And she was grateful for that, grateful for the mother she had had, even if that mother had kept such a significant secret. She was angry at their father, though. Angry at Richard Whitmore for his inability to love her fully, for his distance and coldness, for making her feel unwanted her entire life. She understood why he had struggled, understood that seeing her must have been a constant reminder of his wife's betrayal. But understanding did not erase the pain of growing up feeling like she was not good enough, like she did not belong. That pain was real, and it was his fault, and she was not ready to forgive him for it, even in death. As for the inheritance, Olivia said she was taking her share. Not because she wanted the money, but because she had earned it. She had been a Whitmore for 34 years, had lived in that house, had called Richard Whitmore her father, had played the role she had been assigned. The money was compensation for that, for the years of feeling unloved, for the emotional damage that distance had caused. She would take it and use it to build a new life, a life where she was not defined by the Whitmore name or the Whitmore expectations. And she had decided to reach out to James Brennan, her biological father. She had already made contact, had sent him a letter explaining who she was and asking if he would be willing to meet. She did not know what would come of it, did not know if he would want a relationship with her or if he would reject her. But she needed to try, needed to know where she came from, needed to understand the other half of her genetic heritage. Claire felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to Olivia speak. She reached across the table, taking her sister's hand, and was relieved when Olivia did not pull away. She told Olivia that she loved her, that she would always love her, that nothing about their relationship had changed as far as she was concerned. They were sisters, had been sisters their entire lives, and some DNA test was not going to change that. Marcus echoed the sentiment, his voice thick with emotion. He said that Olivia was his sister, period, end of discussion. He did not care what the DNA said, did not care about biology. They had grown up together, had fought and laughed and cried together, had been there for each other through everything. That was what made them family, not some genetic marker. Olivia smiled then, a small, sad smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She said she appreciated that, truly appreciated it, but that she needed time. Time to figure out who she was now, time to process everything that had happened, time to build a relationship with James Brennan if that was possible. She was not cutting them out of her life, but she needed distance for a while. She hoped they could understand that. Claire said she understood, even though it hurt. Marcus nodded, looking like he wanted to argue but knowing it would do no good. They finished their coffee in a silence that was not quite comfortable but not quite hostile either, and then Olivia left, walking out of the cafe and out of their lives, at least for the moment. The months that followed were difficult. Claire and Marcus stayed in touch, talking regularly, supporting each other through the grief and confusion. They worked with Mr. Ashworth to settle the estate, dividing the assets according to their father's wishes. The house was sold, and with it went the last physical reminder of their childhood. Claire found herself crying as she watched the movers pack up the furniture, the books, the photographs that had documented their family's history. It felt like an ending, like the final chapter of a story that had turned out very differently than she had expected. Olivia kept her distance, sending occasional texts to let them know she was all right but not engaging in any real conversation. Claire respected her sister's need for space, but it was hard. She missed Olivia, missed the relationship they had had before everything fell apart. She wondered if they would ever get back to that place, or if the revelation had damaged their bond beyond repair. Then, 6 months after the DNA results had been revealed, Olivia called. Her voice sounded different, lighter somehow, less burdened. She asked if Claire and Marcus would be willing to meet her for dinner, said there was someone she wanted them to meet. Claire agreed immediately, her heart leaping with hope. The restaurant Olivia chose was in Boston, a small Italian place with red checkered tablecloths and the smell of garlic and tomato sauce filling the air. Claire arrived with Marcus, both of them nervous and excited. They found Olivia waiting at a table in the back, and sitting next to her was a man in his early 60s with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair. He stood when they approached, extending his hand with a warm smile. This was James Brennan, Olivia's biological father. He was a retired doctor, soft-spoken and gentle, with an easy manner that immediately put Claire at ease. He told them how shocked he had been to receive Olivia's letter, how he had never known about her existence. Catherine had never told him she was pregnant, had ended their brief relationship without explanation. He had thought about her over the years, had wondered what had happened to her, but had never imagined that she had been carrying his child. Meeting Olivia, James said, had been one of the greatest gifts of his life. He had always wanted children but had never married, had devoted himself to his medical practice instead. Discovering that he had a daughter, a wonderful, intelligent, brave daughter, had filled a hole in his life he had not even known was there. They had been getting to know each other over the past few months, taking it slowly, building a relationship based on honesty and mutual respect. Olivia looked happier than Claire had seen her in years, maybe ever. There was a lightness to her, a sense of peace that had been missing before. She talked about the time she had spent with James, the conversations they had had, the ways in which she saw herself reflected in him. They had similar mannerisms, similar ways of thinking, similar interests. It was strange and wonderful, she said, to finally understand where certain parts of herself came from. But she also made it clear that this did not mean she was abandoning Marcus and Claire. They were still her siblings, still her family. She had just expanded her definition of family to include James. She hoped that they could all find a way to coexist, to build something new from the wreckage of what had been. Dinner was surprisingly pleasant. James was easy to talk to, asking questions about their lives and sharing stories about his own. He did not try to replace Richard Whitmore, did not try to claim some paternal authority he had not earned. He was simply a man getting to know his daughter's family, trying to find his place in a complicated situation. As the evening wore on, Claire found herself relaxing, found herself actually enjoying the conversation. She watched Olivia laugh at something James said, saw the way her sister's face lit up, and felt a complicated mix of emotions. There was happiness that Olivia had found this connection, this person who could give her the unconditional love and acceptance she had always craved. But there was also sadness for what they had all lost, for the family they had been before the truth came out. After dinner, as they stood outside the restaurant saying their goodbyes, Olivia pulled Claire and Marcus aside. She thanked them for coming, for being willing to meet James, for not making this harder than it already was. She said that she knew the past 6 months had been difficult for all of them, but that she thought maybe they were coming out the other side. Maybe they could build something new, something honest, something that was not based on secrets and lies. Claire hugged her sister tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, feeling the solid warmth of her body. She realized that she had been afraid, truly afraid, that she had lost Olivia forever. But here she was, changed but still recognizably herself, still willing to be part of their lives. It was not the same as it had been before, could never be the same, but maybe it could be something just as good, just as meaningful. Marcus hugged Olivia too, and Claire saw tears in his eyes. He told Olivia that he loved her, that he was proud of her, that he thought she was the bravest person he knew. Olivia laughed and cried at the same time, and for a moment they were just 3 siblings, holding on to each other, trying to navigate an impossible situation together. The years that followed brought more changes. Claire eventually left teaching and started writing, channeling her experiences into a novel about family secrets and the complicated nature of identity. The book was published to modest success, and she found that the process of writing it had been therapeutic, had helped her make sense of everything that had happened. Marcus divorced his wife, admitting that the stress of the inheritance situation had revealed cracks in their marriage that had been there all along. He moved back to New England, closer to Claire and Olivia, and started his own consulting firm. He seemed happier, more relaxed, less driven by the need to prove himself that had characterized so much of his life. Olivia thrived. She went back to school, got a degree in social work, and started working with adopted children and families dealing with identity issues. She said that her own experience had given her insight and empathy that made her good at her job. She and James developed a close relationship, spending holidays together, talking on the phone several times a week. She also maintained her relationship with Claire and Marcus, though it was different now, more honest but also more distant in some ways. They gathered once a year, on the anniversary of their father's death, to remember him and their mother and the family they had been. These gatherings were bittersweet, filled with laughter and tears, old stories, and new understanding. They talked about their parents with more honesty now, acknowledging their flaws and mistakes while still honoring the love and care they had provided. They talked about the inheritance, about how the money had changed their lives in ways both good and bad. And they talked about the future, about how they wanted to move forward as a family, redefined but not destroyed. 5 years after the DNA results had been revealed, Claire found herself back at the Whitmore estate, or rather, at the property where the estate had once stood. The house had been torn down by the new owners, replaced with a modern structure that bore no resemblance to the home where she had grown up. She stood at the edge of the property, looking at the unfamiliar building, and felt a strange sense of closure. Marcus and Olivia were with her, along with James Brennan. They had come together to scatter their mother's ashes, something they had never done because they had not been able to agree on a location. But now, standing here at the place where Catherine Whitmore had raised her children and kept her secrets, it felt right. They took turns saying a few words, sharing memories of Catherine. Marcus talked about her kindness, the way she had always made him feel loved and valued. Claire talked about her strength, the way she had held the family together even when things were difficult. Olivia talked about her courage, the choice she had made to keep her baby and raise her as her own, despite the complications it created. James Brennan spoke too, his voice soft and full of emotion. He said that he had never known Catherine well, that their relationship had been brief and ultimately insignificant in the grand scheme of his life. But she had given him the greatest gift imaginable, a daughter he had never known he wanted but could not now imagine living without. For that, he would be eternally grateful. They scattered the ashes together, watching as the wind caught them and carried them away, spreading them across the land where Catherine had lived and loved and made the choices that had shaped all of their lives. It felt like a release, like they were finally letting go of the past and all its complications. Afterward, they went to dinner at a nearby restaurant, the five of them crowded around a table, talking and laughing and occasionally crying. They talked about Catherine and Richard, about the good times and the bad, about the secrets that had been kept and the truths that had been revealed. They talked about how the inheritance had changed them, how it had forced them to confront uncomfortable realities about their family and themselves. But mostly, they talked about the future. Claire was working on her second novel, a story about forgiveness and redemption. Marcus was thinking about getting married again, to a woman he had met through his consulting work, someone who understood his complicated family situation and loved him anyway. Olivia was considering adopting a child, wanting to give a home to someone who needed one, the way Catherine had given her a home. And James, who had become an unexpected but welcome part of their family, talked about retirement, about traveling, about spending more time with Olivia and getting to know his grandchildren if and when they came along. He had been alone for so long, he said, and now he had a family, a strange and complicated and wonderful family that he would not trade for anything. As the evening wore on and the restaurant began to empty, Claire looked around the table at these people who were her family, and all the complicated ways that word could mean. There was Marcus, her brother by blood and by history, the person who had known her longest and understood her best. There was Olivia, her sister by history if not by blood, the person whose strength and resilience never ceased to amaze her. And there was James, who was not related to her at all but who had become part of their story, part of their family, through his connection to Olivia. She thought about her father's letter, about his hope that they would stay together despite the revelation. At the time, that hope had seemed naive, impossible. How could they stay together when the very foundation of their family had been revealed as a lie? But now, 5 years later, Claire understood what her father had meant. Family was not just about biology, not just about shared DNA. It was about shared history, shared experiences, shared love. It was about choosing to stay connected even when it would be easier to walk away. They had all made that choice, in their own ways and in their own time. They had chosen to work through the pain and anger and confusion, to build something new from the ruins of what had been. It was not perfect, this new family configuration. There were still moments of tension, still old wounds that had not fully healed. But it was real, and it was honest, and it was theirs. As they left the restaurant and said their goodbyes, promising to see each other soon, Claire felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for years. The inheritance had torn them apart, yes, but it had also forced them to confront truths they had been avoiding, to have conversations they had been putting off, to build relationships based on honesty rather than comfortable lies. In a strange way, it had been a gift, though not one any of them would have chosen. She drove home through the darkness, the road familiar beneath her tires, and thought about the story she was writing, the story of her family. It was a story about secrets and lies, about betrayal and forgiveness, about the complicated nature of love and family. It was a story that did not have a neat, happy ending, because real life rarely did. But it was a story about survival, about resilience, about the human capacity to adapt and grow and find meaning even in the most difficult circumstances. And it was a story that was still being written, still unfolding, with chapters yet to come that none of them could predict. There would be more challenges, Claire knew, more difficult conversations and painful revelations. But there would also be joy and laughter and love, the things that made family worthwhile despite all the complications. She thought about her father, about Richard Whitmore and the choice he had made all those years ago to raise Olivia as his own. It had not been a perfect choice, and he had not executed it perfectly. His inability to fully love Olivia had caused real damage, real pain that would take years to heal. But he had tried, in his own flawed way, to do the right thing. He had kept his family together, had provided for all three of his children, had loved them as best he could. And in the end, by revealing the truth through his will, he had given them the opportunity to build something more honest, more real. It was a painful gift, but a gift nonetheless. Claire chose to believe that he had known that, had understood that the truth, however painful, was better than living with lies. She chose to believe that his final act had been one of love, however imperfect. The road stretched out before her, dark and winding, illuminated only by her headlights. She did not know what lay ahead, what challenges or joys the future would bring. But she knew that she would face them with her family beside her, this strange and complicated and wonderful family that had been broken and rebuilt, stronger for the breaking. She thought about Olivia, about the courage it had taken for her to reach out to James Brennan, to risk rejection in pursuit of truth and connection. She thought about Marcus, about how he had put aside his own relief at being Richard Whitmore's biological son to support his sisters through their pain. She thought about James, about how he had welcomed Olivia into his life without hesitation, giving her the unconditional love and acceptance she had always deserved. And she thought about herself, about how she had changed over the past 5 years. She was more honest now, more willing to confront difficult truths rather than hiding behind comfortable lies. She was more compassionate, more understanding of the complexity of human nature and the choices people made. She was more grateful for the family she had, and all its imperfect glory. The inheritance that had threatened to tear them apart forever had instead transformed them, forcing them to grow and change and ultimately become stronger. It had revealed secrets that needed to be revealed, had answered questions that had haunted them for years, had given them the opportunity to build relationships based on truth rather than assumption. As Claire pulled into her driveway and turned off the car, she sat for a moment in the silence, feeling the weight of the past 5 years settle around her like a familiar blanket. It had been the hardest period of her life, filled with more pain and confusion than she had thought she could bear. But she had borne it, they all had, and they had come through the other side changed but intact. She got out of the car and walked to her front door, the cool night air raising goosebumps on her arms. Inside, her house was warm and welcoming, filled with the books and photographs and small treasures that made it home. She made herself a cup of tea and settled into her favorite chair, pulling out her laptop to work on her novel. The words flowed easily tonight, the story pouring out of her like water from a spring. She wrote about family and secrets, about the lies people told themselves and each other, about the courage it took to face the truth. She wrote about her own family, thinly disguised as fiction, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, trying to find meaning in the chaos. Hours passed, and Claire barely noticed. She was lost in the story, in the world she was creating, in the characters who were and were not her family. She wrote about a father who made a difficult choice and lived with the consequences. She wrote about a mother who kept a secret to protect her family. She wrote about 3 siblings who discovered that their family was not what they thought it was and had to decide whether to stay together or drift apart. And she wrote about love, about the complicated, messy, imperfect love that held families together even when everything else fell apart. She wrote about forgiveness, about the slow, painful process of letting go of anger and hurt. She wrote about acceptance, about learning to embrace the truth even when it was not what you wanted to hear. When she finally stopped writing, the sky outside her window was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. She had written nearly 10,000 words, more than she had ever written in a single sitting. She felt exhausted but also exhilarated, like she had run a marathon and crossed the finish line. She saved her work and closed her laptop, stretching her stiff muscles and yawning. She thought about calling Marcus or Olivia, sharing her excitement about the progress she had made on her novel. But it was too early, and besides, they would understand. They always understood, because they had lived through the same story, had experienced the same pain and confusion and eventual acceptance. They were the only people in the world who truly knew what she had been through, what they had all been through together. Claire made her way to bed, her body heavy with exhaustion but her mind still buzzing with thoughts and ideas. She thought about the inheritance, about the $12 million that had been divided among 3 siblings and had changed all of their lives. The money had been important, certainly, had given them financial security and opportunities they might not have had otherwise. But it was not the most important thing they had inherited from their father. The most important inheritance had been the truth, painful as it was. The truth about their mother's affair, about Olivia's parentage, about the secrets that had shaped their family for decades. That truth had been devastating at first, had felt like it would destroy them. But ultimately, it had set them free, had allowed them to build relationships based on honesty and choice rather than obligation and assumption. And they had inherited each other, Claire realized as she drifted off to sleep. They had inherited the bond of shared experience, the connection of people who had been through something difficult together and had chosen to stay connected. That was worth more than any amount of money, more than any property or investment. That was the real inheritance, the one that would last long after the money was spent and the properties were sold. She dreamed that night of her parents, of Richard and Catherine Whitmore as they had been when she was young. They were in the garden of the old estate, the one that no longer existed, surrounded by roses and sunshine. Her mother was laughing, her head thrown back, her face alight with joy. Her father was smiling, a real smile that reached his eyes, and he had his arm around Catherine's waist, holding her close. In the dream, Claire was a child again, playing with Marcus and Olivia on the lawn. They were all young and innocent, unaware of the secrets their parents kept, unaware of the revelations that would one day tear their family apart and force them to rebuild it. They were simply children, playing in the sunshine, secure in the love of their parents and each other. Claire woke with tears on her cheeks, not sure if they were tears of sadness or joy or some complicated mixture of both. She lay in bed for a long moment, holding onto the dream, trying to preserve the feeling of that innocent happiness before it faded. Then she got up and started her day, carrying the memory of the dream with her like a talisman. The weeks and months continued to pass, each one bringing small changes and new developments. Marcus got married, a small ceremony with just close family and friends. Claire stood up as his best woman, and Olivia gave a toast that had everyone laughing and crying at the same time. James Brennan was there too, sitting in the front row, looking proud and happy to be included. Olivia did adopt a child, a little girl from foster care who had been through more trauma in her short life than anyone should have to endure. Olivia named her Catherine, after the mother who had chosen to keep her and raise her despite the complications. Claire and Marcus became doting aunt and uncle, spoiling little Catherine with toys and books and unconditional love. Claire finished her novel and found a publisher, a small independent press that specialized in literary fiction. The book came out to positive reviews, with critics praising its honest portrayal of family dynamics and its nuanced exploration of identity and belonging. Claire did a small book tour, reading in bookstores and libraries, talking to readers who had their own complicated family stories. At one reading, a woman approached Claire afterward, tears streaming down her face. She said that the book had helped her understand her own family situation, had given her the courage to confront secrets that had been kept for too long. She thanked Claire for writing it, for being brave enough to tell such a personal story. Claire hugged her, feeling the weight of the woman's gratitude and pain, and thought about how stories could connect people, could help them feel less alone in their struggles. She thought about her father's letter, about his hope that the truth would set them free. At the time, it had seemed like a platitude, like something people said when they did not want to face the real consequences of their actions. But now, years later, Claire understood what he had meant. The truth had been painful, had torn them apart for a while, but it had also given them the opportunity to rebuild on a foundation of honesty. And that foundation was stronger, more resilient, than the one built on secrets and lies. 10 years after the DNA results had been revealed, the family gathered again at a beach house that Marcus had rented for a week. It was summer, and the air was warm and salty, filled with the sound of waves and seagulls. Claire sat on the deck, watching as Marcus and his wife played in the sand with their 2 young children. Olivia was down by the water with Catherine, now 8 years old and full of energy and joy, teaching her how to look for shells. James Brennan sat beside Claire, both of them content to watch rather than participate in the active play. He had aged in the past 10 years, his hair now completely white, his movements a bit slower. But his eyes were still kind, still full of warmth and love when he looked at Olivia and Catherine. He told Claire that he had never imagined his life would turn out this way, that he would have a daughter and a granddaughter and an extended family that included people he was not related to by blood. Claire smiled and said that none of them had imagined it, that life had a way of surprising you, of taking you places you never expected to go. She thought about the young woman she had been 10 years ago, standing in the Whitmore estate with that cream-colored envelope in her hands, terrified of what it might contain. She had been so afraid of the truth, so certain that it would destroy everything she held dear. And in a way, it had destroyed things. It had destroyed the comfortable lies they had been living with, the false sense of security that came from not asking difficult questions. It had destroyed the family structure they had known, the roles they had played, the assumptions they had made about who they were and where they came from. But from that destruction had come something new, something more honest and more real. She looked at her family, at this group of people who were connected by blood and history and choice, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. They had been through so much together, had faced challenges that would have broken many families. But they had survived, had chosen to stay connected, had built something beautiful from the wreckage of what had been. Marcus looked up from the sand castle he was building with his children and caught Claire's eye. He smiled, a genuine smile full of love and understanding, and she smiled back. No words were needed. They both knew what they had been through, what they had overcome, what they had built together. Olivia came running up from the beach, Catherine on her heels, both of them laughing and breathless. Olivia's face was flushed from the sun and the exercise, and she looked happier and more at peace than Claire had ever seen her. She had found her place in the world, had built a life that was authentically hers, not defined by the Whitmore name or the expectations that came with it. They all gathered for dinner that evening, crowding around the long table on the deck as the sun set over the ocean. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink and purple, so beautiful it almost hurt to look at. They ate fresh seafood and salad and crusty bread, passing dishes and sharing stories and laughing at old jokes that never seemed to get old. Catherine, who had been told the story of her family in age-appropriate ways as she grew up, asked questions about her grandmother Catherine, the woman she had been named after. Olivia answered honestly, talking about her mother's kindness and strength, about the difficult choices she had made, about the love she had shown to all of her children. She did not shy away from the truth, did not try to make the story simpler or easier than it was. Catherine listened with wide eyes, processing the information in the way that children do, accepting the complexity without judgment. Marcus's children, too young to understand the full story, were more interested in dessert than family history. But they would learn eventually, Claire knew. They would grow up knowing that family was complicated, that people made mistakes, that love could exist alongside pain and confusion. And maybe, knowing that from the beginning, they would be better equipped to handle their own complicated relationships and difficult truths. As the evening wore on and the children were put to bed, the adults stayed on the deck, wrapped in blankets against the cooling air, talking and drinking wine and watching the stars come out. They talked about the past, about Richard and Catherine, about the inheritance and the DNA tests and everything that had followed. But they also talked about the future, about their hopes and dreams, about the lives they were building and the people they were becoming. James Brennan raised his glass in a toast, his voice thick with emotion. He said that he was grateful, more grateful than he could express, for the family he had found in his later years. He had spent so much of his life alone, focused on his work, never realizing what he was missing. But now, surrounded by these people who had welcomed him despite having no obligation to do so, he felt complete in a way he never had before. Olivia raised her glass in response, tears shining in her eyes. She said that she was grateful too, grateful for the truth even though it had been painful, grateful for James and the relationship they had built, grateful for Marcus and Claire who had stood by her even when she had pushed them away. She said that she had spent so much of her life feeling like she did not belong, like she was on the outside looking in. But now she understood that belonging was not about biology or blood. It was about choice, about the decision to show up and be present and love people even when it was hard. Marcus spoke next, his voice steady and strong. He said that the inheritance had been the hardest thing their family had ever been through, but also the most important. It had forced them to confront truths they had been avoiding, to have conversations they had been putting off, to really see each other as complex human beings rather than the roles they played. He said that he was proud of them, proud of the way they had handled an impossible situation, proud of the family they had become. Claire was the last to speak, and she found herself struggling to find the right words. How did you sum up 10 years of pain and growth and transformation? How did you express the depth of love and gratitude you felt for these people who had been through so much with you? She settled for simplicity, raising her glass and saying that she loved them, all of them, and that she was grateful every day for the family they had chosen to be. They clinked glasses, the sound clear and bright in the night air, and drank to family, to truth, to the complicated, messy, beautiful reality of their lives. The ocean whispered against the shore, a constant rhythm that had been there long before they arrived and would be there long after they left. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent to human drama. And on the deck of a rented beach house, a family that had been broken and rebuilt sat together, holding on to each other and the moment, knowing that nothing lasted forever but that this, right now, was enough. The week at the beach house passed too quickly, as good times always do. They spent their days swimming and playing games and cooking elaborate meals together. They spent their evenings talking and laughing and occasionally crying, processing old pain and celebrating new joy. They took hundreds of photographs, trying to capture the moments, to preserve the feeling of connection and love that permeated everything. On the last day, as they packed up to leave, Claire found herself standing on the beach alone, watching the waves roll in and out. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the inheritance that had seemed like such a curse at first but had ultimately been a catalyst for growth and change. She thought about her parents, about the choices they had made and the secrets they had kept, and found that she could forgive them now, could understand that they had been doing the best they could with the knowledge and resources they had. She thought about her siblings, about Marcus with his strength and loyalty, about Olivia with her courage and resilience. She thought about James Brennan, who had become an unexpected but cherished part of their family. She thought about the children, the next generation who would grow up knowing the truth, who would be shaped by this story in ways they could not yet imagine. And she thought about herself, about the woman she had become over the past 10 years. She was stronger now, more honest, more willing to face difficult truths. She was more compassionate, more understanding of human complexity and frailty. She was more grateful, more aware of how precious and fragile family connections were. The inheritance had changed her, had changed all of them, in ways both painful and profound. Marcus came down to the beach to find her, his feet sinking into the sand with each step. He stood beside her in silence for a moment, both of them watching the waves. Then he said, quietly, that he had been thinking about their father's letter, about his hope that they would stay together. He said that he thought Richard Whitmore would be proud of them, proud of the way they had handled everything, proud of the family they had become. Claire considered that, turning it over in her mind. Would their father be proud? It was impossible to know. Richard Whitmore had been a complicated man, driven by forces and fears that Claire would never fully understand. But she chose to believe that Marcus was right, that somewhere, somehow, their father knew what they had accomplished and was pleased. It was a comforting thought, even if it might not be true. Olivia joined them on the beach, Catherine's hand clasped in hers. The little girl ran ahead, chasing the waves and laughing with pure, uncomplicated joy. Olivia watched her with a smile, then turned to her siblings. She said that she had been thinking about writing a letter of her own, a letter to Catherine for when she was older, explaining the family's history and the choices that had been made. She wanted Catherine to know the truth, but she also wanted her to understand that truth was complicated, that people were complicated, that love could exist alongside pain and mistakes. Claire thought that was a beautiful idea, a way of honoring the past while also moving forward. She offered to help Olivia write it, to share her perspective as someone who had been there through it all. Marcus offered the same, and Olivia accepted gratefully. It would be a family project, a way of documenting their story for the next generation, a way of ensuring that the lessons they had learned would not be forgotten. They walked back to the beach house together, the three siblings and the little girl who represented the future. James Brennan was waiting on the deck, and Marcus's wife was loading the last of the luggage into the car. It was time to leave, to return to their separate lives and homes. But they would carry this week with them, would hold on to the feeling of connection and love, would remember that they were family, no matter what challenges lay ahead. As they drove away from the beach house, Claire looked back one last time, watching it recede in the distance. She thought about all the places they had been together, all the moments they had shared. The Whitmore estate where they had grown up, now torn down and replaced. Mr. Ashworth's office where they had learned the truth. The cafe where Olivia had told them about James Brennan. The restaurant where they had scattered their mother's ashes. And now this beach house, where they had come together to celebrate how far they had come. Each place was a marker, a point on the map of their journey. And there would be more places, more moments, more memories to create. The story was not over. It would never be over, not really, because family stories continued as long as there were people to tell them and live them. Claire pulled out her phone and sent a text to the family group chat, the one they had created years ago and used to stay connected across the miles. She wrote simply, "I love you all. Thank you for this week. Thank you for everything." The responses came quickly, hearts and smiley faces and words of love and gratitude. Such simple symbols, but they carried so much weight, so much meaning. She put her phone away and settled back in her seat, watching the landscape roll by. She thought about the novel she was working on, the sequel to her first book. This one was about healing, about the slow process of rebuilding after trauma, about finding joy and meaning in the aftermath of pain. It was, in many ways, the story of her own life, of her family's life, though she was changing enough details to protect their privacy. She wondered what her readers would think of this new book, whether they would connect with it the way they had connected with the first one. She hoped so. She hoped that by sharing her family's story, by being honest about the pain and the struggle and the eventual triumph, she could help other people feel less alone in their own complicated family situations. The drive home took several hours, and Claire used the time to think and plan and dream. She thought about the future, about the books she wanted to write, the places she wanted to travel, the experiences she wanted to have. She thought about her family, about the relationships she wanted to nurture and deepen. She thought about herself, about the person she wanted to become, the life she wanted to live. When she finally arrived home, the sun was setting, painting her small house in shades of gold and amber. She carried her bags inside, breathing in the familiar scent of home, feeling the comfort of her own space settle around her like a warm blanket. She was tired from the drive and the emotional intensity of the week, but it was a good tired, the kind that came from living fully and loving deeply. She made herself dinner, something simple and comforting, and ate it while looking through the photographs from the beach house. Each image captured a moment, a smile, a gesture, a connection. She would print some of these, she decided, would frame them and put them on her walls, would create a visual reminder of the family she had and the love they shared. After dinner, she opened her laptop and started writing. The words came easily, flowing from her fingers like they had been waiting to be released. She wrote about family and forgiveness, about truth and transformation, about the courage it took to face difficult realities and the strength it took to rebuild after everything fell apart. She wrote late into the night, lost in the story, in the world she was creating, in the meaning she was making from her own experiences. When she finally stopped, exhausted but satisfied, she realized that she had written the final chapter of her novel. The story was complete, the arc finished, the characters having reached a place of resolution if not perfect happiness. She read through what she had written, making small edits, and felt a sense of accomplishment wash over her. This book was better than the first, she thought, deeper and more nuanced, more honest about the complexity of human relationships. She saved her work and closed her laptop, then sat for a moment in the quiet of her house. She thought about the inheritance, about the $12 million that had been divided among 3 siblings 10 years ago. The money was mostly gone now, spent on houses and education and investments and the various expenses of living. But what they had gained was worth so much more than money could ever be. They had gained truth, painful as it was. They had gained honesty, the ability to look at each other and themselves without flinching. They had gained resilience, the knowledge that they could survive even the most devastating revelations. They had gained compassion, understanding that people were complicated and flawed and doing the best they could. And they had gained each other, really gained each other, in a way that went deeper than biology or obligation. Claire went to bed that night feeling peaceful, feeling grateful, feeling like she had finally made sense of everything that had happened. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, more difficult moments and painful conversations. Family was never simple, never easy, never finished. But she also knew that they would face those challenges together, that they had built something strong enough to withstand whatever came next. She dreamed again of her parents, but this time the dream was different. Richard and Catherine Whitmore were older in this dream, the age they had been when Claire was an adult. They were sitting together in the garden, holding hands, looking at peace. When they saw Claire, they smiled, and her father spoke, his voice clear and strong. He said that he was proud of her, proud of all of them, proud of the way they had taken the truth he had left them and used it to build something better. Her mother spoke too, her voice soft and loving. She said that she was sorry for the secrets, sorry for the pain, but that she hoped they understood why she had made the choices she had made. She had been trying to protect her family, trying to keep them together, trying to give Olivia the life she deserved. It had not been perfect, but it had been done with love. Claire woke with tears on her cheeks again, but this time they were definitely tears of peace, of acceptance, of closure. She lay in bed for a long moment, holding onto the dream, feeling the presence of her parents even though they were gone. Then she got up and started her day, carrying that feeling of peace with her. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new experiences and new growth. Marcus's children grew older, started school, developed their own personalities and interests. Olivia's daughter Catherine thrived, overcoming the trauma of her early years to become a confident, loving child. James Brennan remained a constant presence in their lives, a grandfather figure to all the children, a friend and confidant to the adults. Claire published her second novel to even better reviews than the first. She did a larger book tour this time, traveling to cities across the country, meeting readers, and hearing their stories. She was struck by how many people had complicated family situations, how many people were dealing with secrets and lies and difficult truths. Her books seemed to resonate with them, to give them hope that healing was possible, that families could survive even the most devastating revelations. At one event, a man approached her with tears in his eyes. He said that he had just learned that his father was not his biological father, that his mother had had an affair decades ago. He was struggling to process the information, struggling to figure out what it meant for his identity and his relationships. Claire's book had helped him, he said, had shown him that he was not alone, that other people had been through similar experiences and had survived. Claire hugged him, feeling the weight of his pain and confusion. She told him what she had learned over the past years, that identity was not just about biology, that family was about choice and love and shared history. She told him that it would be hard, that there would be difficult days and painful conversations, but that he would get through it. And she told him that the truth, however painful, was better than living with lies, because truth allowed for real connection, real understanding, real love. The man thanked her, his voice breaking, and walked away. Claire watched him go, hoping that her words had helped, hoping that he would find his way through the confusion to a place of acceptance and peace. She thought about how far she had come from that day in the Whitmore estate, when she had first learned the truth about her family. She had been so afraid then, so certain that the revelation would destroy everything. But she had survived, had grown, had become stronger and wiser and more compassionate. 15 years after the DNA results had been revealed, the family gathered again, this time for Marcus's 50th birthday. He had rented a large house in the mountains, a beautiful place surrounded by pine trees and fresh air. Everyone came, including James Brennan, now in his late 70s but still active and engaged. The children, older now and more aware of the family's complicated history, asked questions and listened to stories and tried to understand the adults they would one day become. They spent a week together, hiking and cooking and playing games and talking. They celebrated Marcus, toasting his accomplishments and his character and the man he had become. But they also celebrated the family as a whole, the journey they had been on together, the obstacles they had overcome, the love that had sustained them through everything. On the last night, they built a fire in the large stone fireplace and gathered around it, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Marcus stood up, his face serious, and said that he wanted to say something. He had been thinking a lot about their father lately, he said, about Richard Whitmore and the inheritance and the DNA tests that had changed everything. For years, Marcus said, he had been angry at their father for the way he had revealed the truth, for the pain and chaos it had caused. He had thought it was cruel, unnecessary, a final act of control from a man who had always needed to be in charge. But now, 15 years later, he understood. Their father had given them a gift, the gift of truth, the gift of the opportunity to build something real and honest. It had been a painful gift, but it had been necessary. Without that revelation, Marcus said, they would have continued living with lies, with secrets, with the distance and disconnection that came from not really knowing each other. Olivia would have continued feeling unloved and unwanted, never understanding why. Marcus and Claire would have continued in their comfortable ignorance, never questioning the family narrative they had been given. And none of them would have had the opportunity to build the relationships they had now, relationships based on choice and honesty and real love. So he wanted to thank their father, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank him for having the courage to reveal the truth, even knowing the pain it would cause. Thank him for believing that they were strong enough to handle it, that they could survive and even thrive in the aftermath. Thank him for the real inheritance, which was not the money or the property, but the opportunity to become the people they were meant to be. There was silence when Marcus finished speaking, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the sound of someone crying softly. Then Olivia stood up, walked over to Marcus, and hugged him tightly. She said that she agreed, that she too had come to see the DNA test requirement as a gift rather than a curse. It had been devastating at the time, had felt like her entire world was falling apart. But it had also freed her, had given her permission to stop trying to fit into a mold that had never quite fit, had allowed her to discover who she really was. And it had given her James, Olivia said, looking at her biological father with love and gratitude. It had given her a relationship she had never known she needed, a connection that had filled the hole in her heart she had carried her entire life. She would not trade that for anything, not even for the comfort of never knowing the truth. Claire stood up too, joining her siblings by the fire. She said that she had been the most resistant to seeing the inheritance as a gift, that she had clung to her anger at their father for years. But she had come to understand that anger was just a way of avoiding the real work of forgiveness and acceptance. Their father had been human, flawed and complicated like everyone else. He had made mistakes, had caused pain, but he had also loved them in his own imperfect way. And in the end, he had given them the tools they needed to build something better than what they had started with. James Brennan spoke then, his voice soft but clear. He said that he was grateful to Richard Whitmore, a man he had never met, for the choice he had made 35 years ago to raise Olivia as his own. It could not have been easy, James said, to look at a child every day who was the product of his wife's betrayal. But Richard had done it, had provided for Olivia, had given her a home and a family and opportunities she might not have had otherwise. That took strength and character, and James respected him for it. And he was grateful to Richard for revealing the truth, James continued, because it had given him the greatest gift of his life. He had spent so many years alone, focused on his work, never realizing what he was missing. But now he had a daughter, a granddaughter, an extended family that had welcomed him with open arms. His life was richer and fuller and more meaningful than he had ever imagined it could be. And that was because Richard Whitmore had had the courage to tell the truth, even from beyond the grave. The children, who had been listening quietly, asked questions then. They wanted to know more about Richard and Catherine, about the choices they had made and the reasons behind them. The adults answered as honestly as they could, not shying away from the difficult parts, not trying to make the story simpler or easier than it was. They talked about love and betrayal, about secrets and truth, about the complexity of human relationships and the importance of forgiveness. Marcus's oldest child, a thoughtful boy of 12, asked if they thought Richard and Catherine had been happy together, despite everything. The adults looked at each other, considering the question. Claire answered first, saying that she thought they had been happy, in their own way. They had loved each other, had built a life together, had raised 3 children. The affair and the secret had complicated things, had created distance and pain, but it had not destroyed their love. They had chosen to stay together, to work through the difficulty, to build something that lasted until death separated them. Olivia added that she thought her mother had carried a heavy burden, the weight of her secret and the knowledge of the pain it had caused. But she had also been a good mother, loving and present and devoted to her children. She had made a mistake, but she had spent the rest of her life trying to make up for it, trying to give her family the love and stability they needed. That took courage and strength, and Olivia honored her for it. Marcus said that he thought their father had struggled more, had found it harder to move past the betrayal. But he had tried, had done his best to be a good father to all 3 of his children, even when it was difficult. And in the end, he had found a way to give them the truth, to free them from the lies that had shaped their family for so long. That was his final gift, his way of making amends for the distance and the pain. The conversation continued late into the night, the fire burning down to embers, the children eventually falling asleep on the couches and chairs. The adults stayed up, talking and remembering and processing, doing the work of family, the work of staying connected and understanding each other. It was hard work, Claire thought, but it was also the most important work there was. When they finally went to bed, the house quiet and peaceful, Claire lay awake for a while, thinking about everything that had been said. She thought about her father's letter, about his hope that they would stay together. They had done more than stay together, she realized. They had grown together, had transformed together, had become something stronger and more resilient than they had been before. The inheritance that had threatened to tear them apart forever had instead become the foundation for something new, something honest, something real. It had forced them to confront difficult truths, to have painful conversations, to really see each other as complex human beings rather than the roles they played. And in doing so, it had given them the opportunity to build relationships based on choice and love rather than obligation and assumption. Claire thought about the title of her first novel, Not Everything Is What It Seems. It had been inspired by her family's story, by the revelation that had turned their world upside down. But now she understood that the title had a deeper meaning. Not everything was what it seemed, but that was not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes, when you looked beneath the surface, when you had the courage to face difficult truths, you found something more real, more meaningful, more valuable than what you had started with. She fell asleep thinking about that, about the journey her family had been on, about the people they had become. And she dreamed of the future, of the years still to come, of the moments they would share and the memories they would create. The story was not over. It would never be over. But they had reached a place of peace, of acceptance, of understanding. And that was enough. 20 years after the DNA results had been revealed, Claire found herself back at a cemetery, standing in front of her parents' graves. She had not been here in years, had not felt the need to visit the physical markers of their deaths. But today, on the 20th anniversary of her father's death, it felt right to come, to pay her respects, to acknowledge the role her parents had played in shaping the person she had become. Marcus and Olivia were with her, along with James, Brennan, and all the children, now teenagers and young adults. They stood together in the cool autumn air, the leaves falling around them in shades of red and gold. Claire looked at the headstones, at the names and dates carved into the granite, and felt a complicated mix of emotions. Love and anger, gratitude and resentment, forgiveness and lingering pain. All of it was true, all of it was valid, all of it was part of the story. She thought about what she would say to her parents if she could speak to them now. She would tell them that she understood, that she knew they had been doing the best they could with the knowledge and resources they had. She would tell them that she forgave them for the secrets and the lies, for the pain and the distance, for the imperfect love they had given. She would tell them that she was grateful for the life they had provided, for the opportunities they had given her, for the siblings they had raised her with. And she would tell them that she was proud of the family they had become, the family that had survived the revelation and grown stronger because of it. She would tell them that their grandchildren were thriving, that they were being raised with honesty and love, that they knew the truth about their family's history and were not ashamed of it. She would tell them that the inheritance they had left, both the money and the truth, had been used well, had been transformed into something beautiful and meaningful. But she could not speak to them, could only stand at their graves and think these thoughts. So instead, she spoke to her siblings, to James, to the children. She told them that she loved them, that she was grateful for them, that she could not imagine her life without them. She told them that family was the most important thing, more important than money or success or any other measure of achievement. She told them that the work of family, the work of staying connected and understanding each other, was hard but worth it. Marcus spoke too, his voice steady and strong. He said that he had learned more from the inheritance situation than from any other experience in his life. He had learned about the complexity of human nature, about the importance of truth, about the power of forgiveness. He had learned that family was not about perfection, but about showing up, about being present, about loving people even when it was hard. And he had learned that he was stronger than he thought, that he could survive even the most devastating revelations and come out the other side intact. Olivia was the last to speak, and her voice was soft but clear. She said that she had spent so much of her life feeling like she did not belong, like she was on the outside looking in. But the DNA test, as painful as it had been, had freed her from that feeling. It had given her permission to stop trying to fit into a mold that had never quite fit, to embrace who she really was, to build a life that was authentically hers. And it had given her James, a father who loved her unconditionally, who saw her for who she was and celebrated her. For that, she would be eternally grateful. James Brennan placed flowers on both graves, a gesture that moved Claire deeply. He said that he was grateful to Richard and Catherine Whitmore, grateful for the choices they had made, grateful for the daughter they had raised. He said that he hoped they were at peace, wherever they were, and that they knew their children were thriving, that the family they had built was strong and loving and honest. The children stood quietly, respectfully, taking in the moment. They had grown up knowing the story, knowing the truth about their family's complicated history. It had shaped them, had made them more understanding, more compassionate, more aware of the complexity of human relationships. They would carry that knowledge with them into their own adult lives, would use it to build their own families, would pass it on to their own children someday. As they left the cemetery, walking back to their cars, Claire felt a sense of closure that she had not expected. She had made peace with her parents, with their choices and their mistakes, with the love they had given and the pain they had caused. She had made peace with the inheritance, with the revelation that had changed everything, with the journey it had set them on. And she had made peace with herself, with the person she had become, with the life she had built. They went to dinner afterward, all of them crowding into a large private room at a restaurant that had been one of Richard Whitmore's favorites. They ordered too much food and told stories and laughed until their sides hurt. They toasted Richard and Catherine, honoring their memory while also acknowledging their flaws. They toasted each other, celebrating the family they had become, the bonds they had forged, the love that sustained them. And they toasted the future, to the years still to come, to the experiences they would share, to the next generation who would carry the family story forward. Claire looked around the table at these people she loved, these people who had been through so much with her, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. This was her family, in all its complicated, messy, beautiful reality. And she would not trade it for anything. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, heading back to their hotels or homes, Claire found herself alone with Olivia for a moment. Her sister looked at her with eyes that were clear and peaceful, so different from the wild, broken look she had had 20 years ago when she had run from Mr. Ashworth's office. Olivia said that she had been thinking about writing a book of her own, about her experience of discovering she was not who she thought she was, about the journey of finding her biological father and building a new identity. Claire encouraged her, said that she thought Olivia's story would resonate with many people, would help others who were going through similar experiences. She offered to help if Olivia wanted, to share what she had learned about the writing and publishing process. Olivia accepted gratefully, and they made plans to meet regularly to work on the project together. As Claire drove home that night, she thought about how far they had all come, how much they had grown and changed. 20 years ago, she had been terrified of the truth, certain that it would destroy everything she held dear. But the truth had not destroyed them. It had transformed them, had forced them to grow and change and become stronger. It had given them the opportunity to build something real and honest and meaningful. She thought about the inheritance, about the $12 million that had been divided among 3 siblings 2 decades ago. The money was long gone, spent on houses and education and investments and the various expenses of living. But what they had gained was priceless. They had gained truth and honesty and real connection. They had gained resilience and strength in the knowledge that they could survive anything. They had gained each other, really gained each other, in a way that went deeper than biology or obligation. And they had gained wisdom, the understanding that family was complicated, that people were flawed, that love could exist alongside pain and mistakes. They had learned that forgiveness was possible, that healing took time, that the work of staying connected was hard but worth it. They had learned that not everything was what it seemed, but that beneath the surface, if you had the courage to look, you could find something real and valuable and true. Claire arrived home to her quiet house, the place that had been her sanctuary through all the years of turmoil and growth. She made herself a cup of tea and settled into her favorite chair, pulling out her laptop. She had been working on a third novel, a story about legacy and what we leave behind, about the ways in which our choices ripple out and affect the people we love long after we are gone. It was inspired by her father, by Richard Whitmore, and the choice he had made to reveal the truth through his will. She wrote late into the night, the words flowing easily, the story taking shape beneath her fingers. She wrote about a man who kept a secret for decades, who struggled with the weight of that secret, who finally found a way to reveal the truth and set his family free. She wrote about the pain and chaos that followed, about the way the revelation tore the family apart before ultimately bringing them back together, stronger and more honest than before. And she wrote about forgiveness, about the slow, difficult process of letting go of anger and hurt, of understanding that people were complicated and flawed and doing the best they could. She wrote about the courage it took to face difficult truths, to have painful conversations, to really see each other as complex human beings rather than the roles they played. She wrote about love, about the messy, imperfect, enduring love that held families together even when everything else fell apart. When she finally stopped writing, the sky outside her window was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. She had written the final chapter, had brought the story to a close. She read through what she had written, making small edits, and felt a sense of satisfaction wash over her. This book was different from her first two, more reflective, more focused on the internal journey than the external events. But it felt true, felt honest, felt like the culmination of everything she had learned over the past 20 years. She saved her work and closed her laptop, then sat for a moment in the quiet of her house. She thought about her family, about the journey they had been on together, about the people they had become. She thought about her parents, about the choices they had made and the legacy they had left. She thought about herself, about the woman she had become, about the life she had built from the wreckage of what had been. And she felt grateful. Grateful for the inheritance, both the money and the truth. Grateful for her siblings, for their strength and resilience and love. Grateful for James Brennan, who had become an unexpected but cherished part of their family. Grateful for the children, the next generation who would carry the story forward. Grateful for the journey, for the pain and the growth and the transformation. She went to bed as the sun rose, feeling peaceful and complete. She had made sense of her family's story, had found meaning in the chaos, had transformed pain into wisdom. She had written it all down, had shared it with the world, had helped others feel less alone in their own complicated family situations. And she had built a life that was authentic and meaningful, a life based on truth and honesty and real connection. She dreamed that night of the future, of the years still to come. She saw her family gathered together, older but still connected, still loving each other despite the complications and challenges. She saw the children grown into adults, building their own families, passing on the lessons they had learned. She saw herself as an old woman, surrounded by the people she loved, looking back on a life well lived, a life that had meaning and purpose and love. And she saw her parents, Richard and Catherine Whitmore, watching over them all with pride and love. They were at peace now, freed from the secrets and lies that had burdened them in life. They could see what their children had become, could see the family that had survived and thrived despite the revelation. And they were proud, so proud, of the strength and courage and love their children had shown. Claire woke feeling refreshed and renewed, ready to face whatever the day would bring. She had work to do, a novel to edit and publish, a life to live, a family to love. But she felt equipped for it all, felt strong and capable and at peace. The inheritance that had threatened to tear them apart forever had instead become the foundation for something beautiful and lasting. And for that, she would be eternally grateful. The story of the Whitmore family, of the inheritance that revealed secrets and changed everything, was a story of pain and transformation, of destruction and rebuilding, of loss and gain. It was a story about the complexity of family, about the lies people told and the truths they hid, about the courage it took to face difficult realities and the strength it took to forgive and move forward. But most of all, it was a story about love. About the messy, imperfect, enduring love that held families together even when everything else fell apart. About the choice to stay connected, to do the hard work of understanding each other, to build something real and honest and meaningful. About the power of truth to set people free, even when that truth was painful and devastating. The inheritance had been $12 million, divided among 3 siblings. But the real inheritance had been the opportunity to become who they were meant to be, to build relationships based on honesty and choice, to transform pain into wisdom and growth. That inheritance was priceless, and it would last long after the money was gone, long after they were all gone, carried forward by the next generation and the generation after that. Not everything was what it seemed. But sometimes, when you had the courage to look beneath the surface, when you were willing to face difficult truths and do the hard work of forgiveness and understanding, you found something more valuable than you ever imagined. You found truth. You found connection. You found love. And you found yourself, your real self, the person you were always meant to be.